It was supposed to be a simple hiking trip, just a weekend getaway to escape the noise of city life. But from the moment I stepped foot into the Alaskan wilderness, I knew something was off. The air felt heavier here, colder, like it carried whispers from the past. It's funny how we never think to question the silence of nature until it turns against you. I'd arrived in Anchorage a few days prior, checked into a small, run-down motel that smelled like old carpet and wet wood. The clerk behind the desk barely looked at me as I paid for a night's stay. He handed me the key and muttered something about staying out of the woods after dusk. I chalked it up to local superstition and let it slide. But even his voice had a strange quality to it, low, as if he were afraid someone might overhear. The next morning, I rented a rugged SUV, packed a few supplies, and drove out to a remote trailhead. The kind of place where the air smells like pine needles and you could hear the wind slicing through the trees. I was alone, but that didn't bother me at first. I'd been hiking plenty of times before, and I was well prepared. Or so I thought. By the time I reached the entrance to the trail, it was late afternoon. The sun was beginning to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing. I remember feeling a sudden drop in temperature as I left the vehicle behind, the cold creeping into my bones. But it wasn't just the cold, it was the stillness. There were no birds, no sounds of animals moving through the brush. Nothing, just the crunch of my boots against the dry ground as I set off. The trail was steep at first, winding through thick evergreens that seemed to press in on either side of me. The air was thick with the scent of wet moss and damp earth. For the first few miles, I didn't think much of it. The silence only made the world around me seem more vast and beautiful. But then it happened. I was halfway through the hike when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it didn't feel like the wind. It felt deliberate. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. I glanced around, expecting to see another hiker or perhaps a bear lurking in the underbrush, but nothing. The trees stood silent, the world still. I shook my head and kept walking. Probably just the isolation getting to me, I thought. But the whisper came again. This time, it was clearer, a name, my name. David. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse racing. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing just behind me. But there was nothing, not a soul in sight. I was alone, completely alone. Shaking it off, I continued down the trail, telling myself I was just hearing things. The whispers, however, didn't stop. They followed me as I walked, growing louder with every step, always my name. David. I began to feel paranoid, as if I were being watched from every angle. The trees seemed to shift and groan under the pressure of some unseen force, their branches stretching like skeletal arms. By the time I reached the halfway point, the daylight was fading fast and the forest seemed to close in around me. I knew I had to turn back, but something dark was pulling me forward. A strange compulsion to keep going, as if the wilderness itself was calling me deeper into its depths. As the trail curved, I stumbled across something that stopped me cold in my tracks. A makeshift camp, or what was left of it. A few scattered belongings, sleeping bags, an empty water bottle, and a ripped jacket that had been left behind. My stomach twisted. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't just any camp. The signs of abandonment were recent, too recent. The scent of fresh earth still lingered in the air, but there was something else, a metallic taste, like blood, hanging faintly in the wind. I knelt down to inspect the camp more closely, my hand brushing against the ripped jacket. That's when I noticed the first real sign that something was wrong, a small, blood-stained trail leading off into the trees. I hesitated, a voice in my head screaming at me to leave, but curiosity got the best of me. I followed the trail, heart racing, each step heavier than the last. The further I went, the colder it got, the trees thicker and more oppressive. The whispering was louder now, almost unbearable, as if the voices were coming from every direction. David, come closer. I stumbled into a clearing, my eyes scanning the ground, and that's when I saw it, a body, or rather, what was left of one. It was barely recognizable, stripped of flesh in places, the bones exposed, blackened by something I couldn't understand. The horror of the scene hit me like a punch to the gut, and I almost vomited right then and there. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking. I turned, desperate to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. Something was stopping me, holding me in place. It was as if the forest itself had grown sentient, watching me, judging me, and then I heard it again. The whisper. This time, though, it wasn't just my name. "Don't go," the voice said. "They'll take you too." I spun around, eyes wide, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the eerie calm of the forest. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran. I ran harder and faster than I ever had in my life, back down the trail, the whispers echoing in my ears, urging me to stop. But I couldn't. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the trailhead, I could barely breathe, my heart pounding in my chest. The sun had already set, and the dark shadows of the wilderness seemed to stretch farther than before. I got in the SUV, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I hit the lights of Anchorage. Back at the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Something was waiting for me out there, just beyond the safety of the town. The whispers, the voice, it didn't feel like it was just in my head anymore. It was real. I tried to tell the clerk at the motel what I'd seen, but he only nodded solemnly, as if he'd heard it all before. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "It happens more than you think. People vanish in those woods, never to be found. Some say it's the wilderness itself. Others say it's something older. Something far more dangerous." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't sure if I believed him, but I knew one thing for certain. Something out there had been waiting for me. The next morning, I went to the police. They didn't seem too interested, almost like they were used to the reports. A tourist goes missing. It happens. They'd tell the search teams to look for a few days and then move on. But something had changed in me. I wasn't the same person who walked into those woods. I haven't gone back to Alaska since. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that whisper. It calls my name, and I wonder if it's the wilderness or something worse. I thought the woods would be peaceful. That was my mistake. It started with a simple plan, a solo backpacking trip through the dense, winding trails of Alaska. I'd always dreamed of the Alaskan wilderness, untouched, pure, far away from the noise of city life. The idea of solitude, of complete isolation, seemed perfect. No one around for miles, nothing but the sounds of nature, the rhythm of my breath, and the peace of being alone in one of the most beautiful places on earth. That was before everything went wrong. I should have noticed the signs earlier, but when you're out there surrounded by towering trees and endless stretches of moss-covered ground, it's easy to convince yourself that everything's fine, that it's just your mind playing tricks. But looking back, I know now something was already watching me, waiting for the moment I'd realize I wasn't alone. The first odd thing happened on the second day. The weather had been unpredictable. 1 minute, the sun was shining bright, and the next, thick fog rolled in, swallowing the trail ahead. It wasn't unusual for the weather to change quickly in the wild, but it felt different this time, like the fog had a purpose, a heaviness that made the air feel suffocating. Still, I pressed on, hoping to find my way to a cabin I'd marked on my map. I'd heard that people had used it for rest on longer trips, and it seemed like the perfect place to take a break. By the time I reached the cabin, the fog had turned to rain, cold and unrelenting. I was wet and exhausted, but I wasn't worried yet. The cabin was small, built into the side of a rocky hill. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but at least it offered shelter from the storm. I spent the night there, listening to the wind howl outside. The creaking of the old structure was almost soothing. But when I woke up the next morning, something felt off. The air had a strange chill to it, even colder than before. As I packed my things, I noticed something that I hadn't seen the night before. Strange scratches on the doorframe. Long, deep gouges, like something had tried to claw its way in. I almost laughed it off, telling myself it was probably just animals, bears, wolves, or whatever else roamed out here. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I decided to leave the cabin earlier than planned. The trail ahead seemed more inviting in the daylight, even if the fog hadn't quite lifted. My footsteps were loud on the soft ground, and the only sound that seemed to break through the stillness was the occasional drip of water falling from the trees above. For hours the silence stretched on, interrupted only by the distant sound of birds in the wind. Then I heard it. At first it was faint, barely noticeable, but then it grew clearer. Footsteps behind me. Someone was walking at my pace, mimicking my every step. But when I turned around, there was no one there. My heart began to race, but I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe it was just an echo, maybe it was the wind, but it didn't stop. The footsteps kept coming. I turned and kept walking faster, trying to push the growing dread down my throat. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But the footsteps kept following me, each step closer, each echo louder, and then a whisper, barely a breath but unmistakable. It said, "Turn around." I froze. Everything inside me screamed to keep moving, but my body didn't obey. Slowly, I turned. The trees around me were thick, casting deep shadows, but there was no one. Nothing, just the trees, the fog, and the silence. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. But as I started walking again, the footsteps followed once more. I wasn't alone. Whatever it was there with me, stalking me through the forest. And the worst part, I couldn't see it, I couldn't hear it directly, but I could feel it. Every step, every breath, every shift of the air around me. I started running. The forest, once so beautiful, turned into a maze of shadows and twisted trees, each one darker and more suffocating than the last. The trail was nowhere to be found, and all I could see were the flickers of dark shapes in the corner of my vision, always out of sight, but never far away. I pushed through the brush, desperate to find a way out. But the more I ran, the more lost I became. The woods closed in around me like they had a life of their own, bending and shifting in ways that didn't make sense. The sun had long since disappeared, leaving only the faintest traces of light behind. I was alone, completely alone, in the dark heart of the Alaskan wilderness. I stumbled across a creek, hoping to find some sign of civilization. The sound of rushing water filled my ears, almost soothing, but it wasn't enough to quiet the panic clawing at my chest. As I crouched beside the water, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold, fresh tracks in the mud. They were large, human-like, but twisted and wrong. Whoever or whatever had been following me was closer than I thought. I had to get out of there. I had to find help. I tried to call for help on my phone, but the signal was gone. No bars, no service, nothing. Panic set in. My mind raced through every possible escape, but each idea felt more impossible than the last. Then, I heard something else. The sound of breathing. It was heavy and labored, but it wasn't mine. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing at the edge of the creek just beyond the trees was a figure, tall, hollow. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, but everything about it screamed wrong. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I didn't wait to find out. I ran. Every step I took, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The figure, whatever it was closing in, its breath echoing behind me like the sound of death itself. And then, just as I thought I was going to escape, I tripped, falling hard into the mud. When I looked up, the figure was gone. But I wasn't alone. The shadows around me had taken shape and they were moving. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could feel them, thick and dark, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. They whispered my name, and every whisper felt like 1,000 knives piercing my mind. It was them, those who had disappeared before me, those who had been lost in the dark corners of Alaska, just like me. And now I was one of them. When they found my body, it was in the same creek. But there was no sign of what had happened to me. Only the remnants of old scratches on the trees and the strange, twisted tracks in the mud. The last thing I heard before I lost consciousness was a voice, clear and calm, saying, "You should never have come here." They never found the thing that was chasing me. No one believed my story. How could they? After all, it's just another missing tourist, right? But the truth is, I never left those woods. And neither will you. If you ever find yourself in Alaska's darkest corners, I've always prided myself on being a skeptic. It's something I've held on to ever since my early days of travel, especially as a journalist in the world of true crime and the paranormal. But now, standing here alone in the middle of nowhere, in Alaska, a creeping doubt is slowly gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The wilderness around me feels wrong, like it's watching, waiting. I never wanted to believe in the supernatural, but tonight, I'm not so sure. The last 3 days have been a blur. I came here to write about Alaska's chilling reputation for mysterious disappearances. You've heard the stories, hikers and tourists vanishing without a trace, their bodies never recovered. Locals speak in hushed tones about strange occurrences, things you can't explain, like people stumbling off paths and just vanishing, as if the land itself is devouring them. I'll admit, I thought it was all a bunch of exaggerated folklore. That was until I arrived in the small town of Gakona. I was supposed to meet a local guide, an experienced hiker named Jake, who would take me into the wilderness and show me some of the places where people have disappeared. Jake had been recommended to me by a couple of locals at a nearby diner, and I thought I'd be safe after all. I was with an expert. But Jake never showed up. At first, I thought he was just running late, but after waiting for hours, I decided to go ahead without him. Big mistake. I spent the first day hiking alone, feeling like an imposter. There I was, a city slicker in a vast, snow-covered landscape, trying to act like I belonged. The forest was thick with evergreens, their skeletal branches weighed down by a heavy layer of snow. The wind howled through the trees like an animal in pain, and the sky was a dull gray, casting everything in a muted, cold light. Despite the beauty of the place, I felt uneasy. I wasn't scared exactly, but there was a palpable sense of something I couldn't quite place. At night, back in the cabin I rented, I could hear the wind outside, its howls muffled by the thick walls. But it wasn't just the wind that kept me awake. The noises, small noises, drifted through the silence. Scratching sounds, footsteps, and a faint whispering on the wind. I told myself it was just the trees or the wildlife, but something about it felt wrong. The second day, I decided to hike further into the wilderness, deeper into the area where people had gone missing. My nerves were starting to get the best of me, but I figured I was just being paranoid. I had a map, a compass, and I'd done my homework. I was prepared, or so I thought. Around midday, the weather shifted. The wind picked up, and the snow began to fall harder. My visibility dropped to nothing, and the path I was following became nearly invisible beneath the thick blanket of snow. I should have turned back, but I pressed on, telling myself I couldn't leave without at least seeing the area where the disappearances had occurred. I couldn't go back to the diner without something to show for it. Then I found something. A small clearing in the woods in the center, half buried in the snow, was a broken-down shack. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd seen. I was certain no one had mentioned it, but there it was, standing like a ghost from another time. I hesitated. There was something about it that screamed wrong. I wanted to turn back, but the thought of not knowing what was inside drove me forward. I pushed open the door, which creaked on rusty hinges. The interior was dark, save for a thin sliver of daylight filtering through the cracks in the walls. There were remnants of old rotting furniture scattered about, an overturned chair, a bed frame stripped of its mattress. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. A blood-stained blanket lay in the corner, its crimson streaks faded from years of exposure. Next to it was a shoe, a hiking boot just like the ones I was wearing, except older, much older. It looked like it had been there for years. Then I saw it. A piece of paper, yellowed with age, pinned to the wall with a rusted nail. I couldn't make out all the details, but the message was clear. We went into the woods, they told us not to, but we did. Now we're lost, help us. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. That was when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right. There was no logical reason for this place to exist, and there was no reason for me to be here either. I turned to leave, but the moment I stepped outside, the temperature seemed to drop. The wind howled louder, swirling snowflakes into my face like needles. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing in the deep snow, and when I looked up I thought I saw something. No, someone standing in the distance. A figure, tall, gaunt, and draped in tattered clothing. It was still, but its presence was like a punch to the gut. I blinked, the figure was gone. I tried to rationalize it. My mind was playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew I had seen it. And worse, I wasn't sure if it was real or something else. I started to make my way back to the cabin, but the path had changed. The snow had completely covered it. I tried retracing my steps, but every direction I went led me deeper into the woods. I could feel the temperature dropping, the cold seeping into my bones. My breath came in ragged gasps. Suddenly, I heard something. A voice. It was faint, barely a whisper over the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. It was a plea. A call for help. Someone was out there. I tried to follow the sound, but with every step the voice seemed to drift further away. I was walking in circles. Panic started to rise in my chest as the shadows lengthened around me. The sun was gone and the sky was nearly pitch black. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. The shadows weren't just trees, they were figures. Moving figures watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as I started running, my feet slipping on the ice, my breath ragged. I could hear the whispers again, clearer now. It wasn't just one voice, there were several, a chorus of voices begging for help. Or was it? I couldn't be sure. I didn't look back. Finally, I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto a road. I collapsed in the snow, gasping for air, and after what felt like an eternity, a truck pulled up. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, stared at me like I was crazy when I asked if he'd seen anyone out there. "No," he said, his voice low. "But you're lucky you got out. People don't come back from those woods, kid. Once you hear them, you're already lost." I didn't ask what he meant. I just got in the truck and kept my eyes straight ahead, knowing something was following me. Something had been in those woods with me. Something still out there. I didn't return to Gakona. I couldn't. I never went back to Alaska. And I still don't talk about what happened, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was that calls those woods home, it's not done with me yet. And I can't shake the feeling that it never will be. I've always been the kind of person who takes the scenic route, who enjoys the calm, the quiet, and the solitude of nature. A backpack, a map, and a sturdy pair of boots were all I needed for a weekend getaway. But that was before Denali, before that godforsaken mountain. Now, when I close my eyes, it's all I can see, its shadow looming in my mind. I never imagined it would happen to me. I thought I was just a tourist, like all the others. I thought I was prepared. But no one told me about the whispers in Denali, or the way the air could turn cold enough to freeze your thoughts in place. It started simple enough. I was on a solo trek, an escape from the stresses of city life. Denali National Park, the largest in the U.S., was my choice for the weekend. Rugged landscapes, snow-covered peaks, the thrill of adventure. I'd heard the stories about people disappearing in the wilderness, but those were always other people. People who had wandered too far off trail or made a poor decision. I wasn't going to be like that. I had researched my route. I had all the right gear, and yet something deep inside my gut told me I was making a mistake the moment I crossed into that park. It was that feeling you get when you're being watched. Unseen eyes, the kind of presence that presses on your chest when the wind dies down, when the trees no longer rustle, and the silence feels wrong. The first evening, I set up camp near a small clearing. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the land. The mountains in the distance were covered in a soft mist, making them look even more imposing. I didn't think much of it, just another evening in the wild, right? I tried to start a fire, but the wood was damp from earlier rain, and the cold was starting to settle in. I could see my breath puffing in the air. I shook my head, telling myself I was overreacting. But the wind howled in a way I'd never heard before, bending the trees unnaturally. I figured it was just the weather. But then I heard it. A voice, a whisper, so faint I almost thought it was my imagination. At first I chalked it up to the wind or some animal. But then I heard it again. "Help me, please." I froze. My heart hammered in my chest, and I quickly looked around. No one. There was no one else in the clearing, just the sound of the wind rattling the trees. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just the isolation messing with my head. But that wasn't the end of it. Every night after that, the whispers grew louder, more desperate, like someone was lost and trying to reach me, but I could never find them. I had been hiking through the area for 3 days, and the feeling that something was wrong was inescapable. The forest was vast, eerie, and the further I ventured, the more the air felt suffocating. It was as though the wilderness itself was alive, pressing against me, pushing me away. It wasn't until the 4th night that things took a darker turn. I was camped out near a series of caves I'd found on my map. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and the night was quiet, too quiet. That was when I saw it, a flash of movement in the distance. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe an animal, but it wasn't. It was a figure moving swiftly through the trees. It looked wrong, the way it moved, like it didn't quite fit into the natural rhythm of the world. The figure was far enough away that I couldn't make out details, but I could sense it. Its eyes locked with mine, and the chill that ran down my spine wasn't just the cold of the night. It was something deeper, something primal. I tried calling out, but my voice caught in my throat. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the figure, but it was gone. The forest around me was as still as a graveyard. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, if the isolation had finally gotten to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I debated leaving, but I was miles from civilization, and the thought of getting lost in that cold, dark wilderness was even worse than staying put. So I stayed, trying to calm myself down. The next morning, I packed up early, eager to get moving. I was heading toward the mountain pass, hoping to find another trail that would lead me out. But as I walked deeper into the wilderness, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. A broken backpack, half buried in the snow. The contents were scattered around clothes, a camera, and a map stained with something dark. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. The image of that torn, discarded bag haunted me. I felt the blood drain from my face. There were people out here, real people, and they had vanished. I turned to leave, but something invisible kept me rooted to the spot. The wind picked up again, the whispering voices growing louder until they were nearly deafening. Help me, please. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. The voice was real, and it was coming from somewhere close, too close. I stumbled back, spinning around, looking for any sign of movement, any hint of life. But there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive silence of the forest, and the faintest sound of footsteps behind me. Thump, thump, slow, deliberate, closer. I could feel my pulse quickening. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. I turned again, and this time I saw a person, or what used to be a person. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, and their face was pale, gaunt, and twisted in a grotesque expression. The figure stood motionless, watching me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My feet were frozen, trapped in place by something that felt like the weight of the earth itself. It spoke in a voice that was both familiar and foreign at the same time. You shouldn't have come here. I didn't wait to hear more. My legs moved before my mind could catch up, and I ran. I ran through the trees, past the caves, through the snow, with nothing but the pounding of my heart and the sounds of someone or something following me. The whispers were louder now, all around me. They surrounded me, drowned me, until they were deafening. I don't remember how long I ran. Time lost meaning. I was a blur of fear and adrenaline, desperate to escape the darkness that was swallowing me whole. I reached the edge of a cliff, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and there at the bottom of the gorge, I saw the outline of a person lying still in the snow. I didn't dare go closer. I turned around and ran again, desperate to get away from the shadows, from the whispers, from whatever this place had become. The trees twisted around me like they were alive, closing in on me, blocking my path. And then in the distance, I saw the mountain looming, its peak hidden in the clouds. Denali, its presence was like a weight on my chest. That was the last thing I saw before everything went black. When they found me, I was lying in the snow, barely conscious, my mind unraveling. They never found the others, the missing tourists, the ones who had disappeared before me. No one can explain what happened. No one knows what that thing was. I haven't been back to Denali, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes on quiet nights when the wind howls just a little too loudly, I hear it again. The whispering voice, calling out for help, and I can never quite shake the feeling that I'm still out there, lost in the shadows of Denali, just waiting for the darkness to claim me. The last thing I remember is stepping out of the car and feeling the bite of the wind against my skin. That sharp, unforgiving cold of Alaska's wild, untouched wilderness. My friends and I had just arrived in Ketchikan, excited for a week-long hiking trip through the Tongass National Forest. It is the kind of place people come to escape the hustle of their lives, to find peace, in nature at least. That's what we thought, but peace is an illusion here. I should have known better. I can't stop thinking about the warnings we got before leaving. A random local sitting at the dive bar in town had leaned in a little too close to me when I asked about the best trails. "Stay on the path," he had said, his eyes wide and unnerving. "Some of these trails go deeper than you think. People get lost, and they don't come back." I laughed it off. I didn't take him seriously. Who would? Now, it's impossible to tell where the forest ends and where the nightmare began. Maybe it was when we veered off the trail to take that shortcut. Or maybe it was when the weather turned blowing snow so hard I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. What happened that day doesn't feel real anymore. It's like a bad dream, one that I wish I could wake up from. We made it to the edge of a ridge that overlooked the valley below. The beauty was unbelievable, but there was this nagging feeling creeping in, like someone was watching us. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. The wind whistling through the trees, the distant crunch of snow beneath our boots. The only thing that seemed real was the sound of our laughter, echoing against the stillness. But something wasn't right. The first weird thing happened right after we set up camp. The fire pit crackled and popped as I sat, staring into the flames. I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, of something in the shadows. The trees felt alive, like they were leaning in to listen. Every gust of wind felt too deliberate too, knowing. But it wasn't until nightfall when things took a turn for the worse. I woke up to the sound of someone walking around our tent. At first I thought it was just one of the others, but then it came again. A soft footstep, then a crunch of snow, then silence, and then another. I glanced at the others. They were all asleep, snoring softly. I lay perfectly still, heart racing, straining to hear. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps. Human footsteps. I couldn't make sense of it. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam sliced through the dark, trembling in my hands as I peeked out of the tent. Nothing. The woods were still, silent. But that silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt suffocating, like something had stopped the world just for me. I lay back down, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. But when I closed my eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, hidden just beyond the tree line. The next morning, everything felt wrong. We broke camp and continued our hike, but the air was thick with unease. I couldn't help but notice how quiet the woods were. There were no birds, no animals, just the wind and the crunch of our boots. That's when we saw it. A trail of fresh footprints in the snow, but they weren't ours. They were big, far too big for any of us. They led off the trail and deeper into the forest, toward a cliffside that looked like it had been untouched for years. We should have turned back. But we didn't. We followed. We trudged through the snow for what felt like hours, the air growing colder with every step. But it wasn't just the temperature that was dropping. There was a strange, unsettling shift in the atmosphere. I kept hearing things in the distance, whispers maybe, or voices. I couldn't tell if they were real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Finally, we reached a clearing. In the center stood a lone, weathered cabin. It looked ancient, like something out of a horror movie. Its wood was dark and worn, the roof sagging under the weight of years and snow. A feeling of dread washed over me as we approached it, as though this place had been forgotten by time, and for good reason. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The smell of rot and something worse, something metallic, something human. Then we saw it, a photograph, pinned to the wall with an old rusty nail. A group of hikers, all wearing identical expressions of terror. But what caught my eye was the date on the bottom of the photo, the 18th of October, 1987. That was the year the first tourist disappeared in the region. The same year that the locals started telling stories about the Watcher in the woods. We were standing in a room where people had vanished, where people had never come back. My heart hammered in my chest as I pulled away from the wall, suddenly desperate to leave. But as I turned, the door slammed shut. Hard, the sound echoed through the cabin like thunder. My friends started shouting, trying to pry the door open, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear their frantic breathing, but it was drowned out by something else. A low hum vibrating through the floorboards. It felt like the earth itself was alive, a pulse beating just beneath us. Then there was a voice. It was soft at first, like a whisper in the wind, but then it became clearer, a voice that wasn't from any of us. It was low and guttural, like it was coming from the walls themselves. Leave. Now. I froze. I should have run. I should have screamed, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly tall, with features obscured by the shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly like two tiny embers burning through the darkness. Its presence was suffocating, terrifying. I could feel its gaze boring into me, like it was waiting for something. I don't remember much after that. There was chaos, screaming, someone, maybe me, was crying. Then the lights flickered and the floor cracked open beneath us. I woke up outside alone, no sign of my friends. No footprints in the snow, just the cold, empty silence of the forest. I ran as fast as I could, never stopping, never looking back. The forest had swallowed them, and it was waiting for me. I don't know what happened to them. The police searched but found nothing. No bodies, no clues, just more questions. The locals whisper about something they call the Watcher, a dark spirit that haunts these woods. Some say it's an ancient entity drawn to the fear of the lost. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I know I believe in what I saw. And I know that something is still out there, waiting. I shouldn't have agreed to this. Not this hike, not this time of year, and definitely not with the storm rolling in. But there I was, trudging through the thick Alaskan wilderness, following a trail that felt wrong. Even the trees seemed wrong. Their skeletal limbs twisted, bent at odd angles, reaching out like they wanted to grab me. The snow crunched beneath my boots, and the wind howled through the bare branches above. The forecast had called for clear skies, but the deeper I ventured, the darker and more oppressive the sky grew. It wasn't supposed to snow today. That's why I went off the beaten path to explore. Because the weather was supposed to be fine. Yet the air had turned unnaturally still, and the world around me felt wrong. I wasn't alone. There were a few of us, just a small group of adventurers seeking the thrill of the wild. But as the day wore on, something changed in the air. Something heavy that made my skin prickle with unease. The others, Ben, Karen, and Will, seemed oblivious, laughing and joking, wrapped up in their own adventure. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by a person, but something far worse. It all started when we saw the tracks. We were following a narrow, frozen creek winding through the woods like a serpent. The path was treacherous, and we had to be careful with every step, lest we slip and fall into the icy water below. That's when I saw them, footprints, stark against the white snow. They were not human. At first, I thought I was mistaken. It was hard to make sense of them. The way they were imprinted so clearly into the snow. Large, elongated tracks, like something massive had been stalking through the woods. But these tracks, these weren't animal tracks either. There was no consistency in the shape, no claws or paws. The depth of the print varied like whatever made them was shifting weight, dragging itself. I stopped, my heart thudding in my chest. "Hey, look at these," I called to the others. Ben, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off. Probably a moose. Could have been moving awkwardly through the snow. I wanted to argue, but something in the back of my mind told me it wasn't a moose. The size, the shape, it didn't fit. We stood there in the eerie silence, each of us staring down at the odd tracks as if waiting for them to do something. To move, it was Karen who broke the tension. "Goose, we should keep moving. The storm's coming in fast." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease that had settled deep in my bones. But the tracks, they weren't just strange. They were wrong. The further we went, the more they seemed to stretch out ahead of us, winding deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer, the shadows darker. I couldn't help but feel that the snow itself was closing in around us, suffocating us. We moved forward, but the tracks didn't stop. They led us deeper and deeper into the woods, twisting and turning like some kind of macabre trail. The others were still oblivious, joking and laughing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The storm finally hit when we reached a clearing. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees like a warning, and the snow came down in a thick blinding curtain. We huddled together, pulling our coats tighter around us. That's when we heard it, a noise, muffled beneath the howl of the storm. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was something distinct about it, a whispering, like a voice calling out from the depths of the forest. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Ben, my breath coming out in white clouds. He nodded, his face pale. I didn't want to say anything. "But I've been hearing things for the past hour," he muttered. "I thought it was just the wind." Will, the least shaken of the group, laughed nervously. "Come on, it's just a bear or something. We're fine, but we weren't fine." The tracks, they were still there. They hadn't stopped leading us, growing more erratic and disjointed. There was no pattern, no rhyme or reason to them. The deeper we went into the clearing, the more they seemed to multiply, fanning out like some twisted spider web. I looked up at the others. "We need to turn back," I said. "This is wrong. The tracks, they're leading us somewhere." Ben's eyes darted nervously to the others. "What do you mean, leading us somewhere? It's just a path." But it wasn't, and that's when I saw it. There, just beyond the trees at the edge of the clearing, something moved. It was large, but it didn't move like an animal. It shifted unnaturally, dragging itself through the snow, its limbs bending at impossible angles. I blinked, and it was gone, vanished, like smoke in the wind. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears. "Did you see that?" I whispered. But my voice cracked, barely a sound over the roar of the storm. Karen had gone pale, her hand gripping her throat. "What was that?" I wanted to say I didn't know, but I couldn't. Something dark, something primal was moving out there in the snow. "Enough of this," Ben snapped, pulling out his compass. "We need to get back now." We turned around, but the tracks, they weren't the same. They had changed. They had shifted, the prints now leading in the opposite direction, toward the woods, towards the clearing we had just passed. My mind raced. No, we have to go the other way. The tracks, they are following us. I was barely able to speak through the fear that had settled in my throat. Ben stopped dead in his tracks, looking at me as if I were insane. "They're just tracks, all right. Calm down. It's the storm messing with your head." But it wasn't the storm. The whispering came again, louder this time, as if the forest itself was calling to us. I turned to face the others, but when I looked back, Ben was gone. His pack lay abandoned on the snow. Karen and Will stared at the empty spot where he had been, their faces frozen in terror. "Where did he go?" Karen gasped, her voice barely audible. We started running, hearts pounding, our footsteps drowned out by the howling wind. But then I heard something, a sound that made my blood freeze. Ben's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling our names from the darkness. I turned, and there he was, his body twisted unnaturally, standing just beyond the trees. His eyes were wide, unblinking, but his mouth, it was open, as if he was screaming, but no sound came out. The air around him shimmered, and for a brief moment his form flickered like a mirage. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, he was gone. The others screamed, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. That's when I understood. The tracks weren't leading us out. They were leading us in. I don't know how I made it out of that forest. I don't know what happened to the others. All I remember is running, heart pounding, the snow filling my boots, and the sound of something following me. I stumbled out of the woods, alone. The storm had passed and the world was eerily quiet, but the tracks, those terrible, shifting tracks, were gone. No one ever found the others. The tracks were never found again, but I can still hear them sometimes, whispers in the wind, a voice calling my name from the depths of the forest, and I know deep down I'm not alone. I should have known better than to go off the beaten path, but I didn't. I thought the dense Alaskan forests would offer nothing more than a peaceful escape, a brief break from my hectic life. How naive. What I found in those woods, hidden in the whispers of the wind and the rustling of leaves, was far darker than I could have imagined. And it wasn't just the cold. The day started innocuously enough. I'd taken a weekend trip to Denali National Park, hoping to get some fresh air and perhaps clear my mind. I'm no expert hiker, far from it, but I figured a couple of days exploring wouldn't hurt. A trailhead called the Savage River Loop caught my attention, a moderate path known for offering stunning views. But as always, I couldn't resist the temptation to wander further off the path. The air was crisp, biting at my skin even through the thick jacket I had on. The sky above was a washed-out gray, clouds pressing down like a heavy blanket. It was the kind of sky that made you feel small, insignificant. It was early spring, but you wouldn't have known it by the look of the place. Snow still clung to the ground, and the trees were skeletal, their bare branches reaching toward the heavens like desperate hands. I hadn't seen another soul in hours. That should have been the first red flag, but I brushed it off. The silence, the utter stillness, felt more like a blessing than anything sinister. That's when I started hearing the voices. It wasn't anything distinct at first, just soft murmurs too far away to make out the words. I told myself it was the wind, but it didn't feel like the wind. It felt intentional, like it was coming from somewhere or someone who knew I was there. I'd stop every few minutes, scanning the surroundings, but there was never anyone in sight. The voices never grew louder, nor did they fade away. It was like they were lingering just on the edge of my awareness, an unsettling presence that I couldn't quite ignore. I pushed forward, trying to shake off the unease. The path twisted and turned, growing narrower as I moved deeper into the forest. Every now and then, I'd hear the snap of a branch behind me, but when I whipped around, there was never anything there. The forest seemed to watch me, its dark eyes peering from behind every tree, every shadow. By the time I reached a small clearing, I was already regretting my decision. The voices had become clearer now, faint but discernible, whispers that seemed to be calling my name. I stood there, frozen. My breath came out in short bursts, visible in the cold air. It was all I could hear now, the whispers curling around me, close enough to make my skin prickle. I checked my phone, hoping for some sign of reassurance, but there was no service. That wasn't unusual out here, but it was enough to fuel the gnawing sense of isolation creeping in. I had no signal, no way to call for help if something went wrong. It wasn't long before I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. A small, tattered backpack lay in the middle of the clearing. There was no one around, no sign of where it came from, or who it belonged to. It was as though it had been abandoned, but it was too recent. The snow around it hadn't yet begun to melt, and the straps were still slightly damp. My heart began to race. I approached cautiously, peering inside. A few items, none of them particularly noteworthy, but what struck me were the stains. Red marks, smeared across the inside of the bag like someone had been in a hurry to leave it behind. I couldn't quite tell if they were blood or something else, but the sight of them twisted my stomach. Then, I saw something that sent a chill through my spine. A scrap of paper, folded and crumpled. I unfolded it slowly, the whispers growing louder, insistent. My fingers trembled as I read the words, scrawled in jagged handwriting. They never left. You won't either. My mind raced. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Was it a joke? Was this some sick prank? I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, not just in the physical sense. Something was out there, something that had been watching me long before I'd set foot in this godforsaken place. I turned to leave, but the whispers had become louder, clearer, more frantic. They weren't voices now. They were screams. Screams of people begging for help, pleading for mercy. They echoed in the forest, surrounding me, cutting through the silence like a blade. I began to run. The trail was barely visible now, swallowed by the thick trees and the growing fog. Every step I took felt like it was leading me deeper into the unknown, further from safety. The screams followed me, and the whispering voices started to merge into something else. Something monstrous. They sounded like people, but they weren't. They were something else. Something twisted. I stumbled. My foot caught on a root, and I fell hard, my knees scraping against the frozen earth. I gasped for breath, my mind reeling, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear them now, footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. Someone, or something, was following me. I shot up and scrambled to my feet, but when I turned there was nothing there. The trees stood like silent sentinels, indifferent to my panic. The fog was thicker now, so thick I could barely see a few feet in front of me. My breath came out in ragged gasps, my heart thundering in my chest. That's when I saw them, figures, human shapes, emerged from the mist. There were 4 of them, pale, gaunt. Their faces obscured by shadows, they moved slowly, deliberately, as though they were part of the fog itself. They were wrong. There was something about the way they moved, like they weren't quite in the same reality as me. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The moment I saw them, I understood. They were the missing tourists. The ones who had vanished from this forest years ago. No one ever found them. They just disappeared. Like so many others, swallowed by the wilderness. But now, they were back. Or at least what remained of them was. I ran again, but this time, I didn't look back. I couldn't. By the time I finally stumbled back to the trailhead, I was covered in sweat, my face pale, my body trembling. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't even bother to look around. I knew they were still out there, waiting, watching. I left Denali the next day. I couldn't stay. I never went back to the forest. But I still hear the whispers. At night, when the wind picks up, when the trees sway, I hear their voices again, soft, faint at first, but growing louder, closer, until they scream my name. And when I close my eyes, I see their faces twisted, broken, but still alive in some way, trapped in that place. They're still out there, and I wonder, how long before they come for me too? I didn't expect to find myself in this situation. Standing at the edge of the Alaskan wilderness, I felt an uncomfortable tension tighten my chest. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and even the trees seemed to lean in, watching. It was supposed to be a routine hiking trip. Just me, a few friends, and the wild open spaces of Alaska. Nothing out of the ordinary, but that was before the phone stopped working. Before the last of the other hikers disappeared, it was a quiet moment when I noticed it. A soft, distant sound of something breaking the silence. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a bear or a moose, but the noise was wrong. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, or at least it sounded like one. I told myself I was just hearing things. The wilderness messes with your mind. People go into the woods and come out with stories about whispers, footsteps following them, things they can't explain. But I didn't believe in that stuff. Not really. Still, the noise kept coming, closer and closer, like someone walking just out of sight. "Hey, did you hear that?" I asked, glancing at Mark, one of my friends who was leading the way. His face was pale, eyes darting around. "Hear what?" he replied, brushing it off. But I saw it, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he adjusted his pack. We kept walking, though I could tell something was off. The trees here were denser than I remembered, their shadows stretching long and twisted in the weak light filtering through the canopy. There were no other hikers, no sounds of birds or the usual life you hear in the forest, just the distant crunch of our boots on the dirt. The noise continued. I wasn't imagining it. There was definitely something, or someone out there. I started to wonder if it was one of the other hikers we'd passed earlier, the couple who had been a few miles ahead of us. But why were they out here in the quiet, moving so strangely? Then the ground shifted under my feet. The path I had walked dozens of times before seemed to be slipping away, replaced by something dark and cold, like the forest was swallowing the trail whole. It was as though the earth itself was changing, erasing any trace of what had been before. "Mark!" I shouted, but he was already gone. I turned, panic setting in, and saw that my other friends had vanished as well. The world around me felt wrong. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. My heartbeat, the scrape of my boots on the underbrush, even the eerie quietness of the forest that seemed to swallow every noise. It was then I saw it. The flash of something white between the trees. A figure, moving quickly just out of sight. At first I thought it was a trick of the light. Then it moved again. I ran toward it, instinct telling me to catch up. But the forest twisted and bent, branches grabbing at me as I sprinted, trying to get to whatever or whoever was out there. The figure seemed to slip further away the more I chased it. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. Closer now, too close. My breath caught in my throat as I looked around. No one was there, yet the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed in my ears. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. That's when I saw the first sign of something truly wrong. A torn backpack half buried under a pile of wet leaves. I knelt down, heart pounding in my chest. It was Mark's, the backpack I had seen him carrying just a few hours ago. The straps were frayed, the zippers half pulled open, as if someone had tried to leave in a hurry. I knew then that something terrible had happened. Mark didn't leave his gear behind. He was the last person to be reckless in these woods. I grabbed the backpack, clutching it to my chest, and stood up. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't hear a thing, not even the usual rustling of the trees in the wind. The silence was suffocating. I looked around, half expecting to see one of my friends emerging from the trees with a smug grin, like it was all some cruel joke, but I wasn't laughing. None of us were. Something was out here, something that didn't want us to leave. I started running again, this time without thinking, pushing through the underbrush, desperate to find the trail again. I needed to get back. But the woods were a maze now. Paths that didn't exist, trees that loomed like dark sentinels, and a cold that seemed to creep into my bones no matter how fast I moved. Suddenly, I tripped, tumbling into a small clearing, and my heart skipped a beat. In the middle of the clearing lay something I couldn't explain, something I wished I hadn't seen. A body, or rather what was left of it. A decayed form half buried in the mud, the face unrecognizable, twisted in a grotesque grimace. The clothes were torn, but I could see that it was wearing the same brand of hiking boots I had seen on the tourists from earlier, the ones who had vanished. I stumbled back, falling to the ground, eyes wide in horror. What had happened here? Who had done this? I wanted to scream, but something stopped me. The oppressive silence around me seemed to close in, pressing down on my chest like a weight. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. Then I heard it. A voice, low and guttural, whispering from somewhere behind me. "Help me." I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The air around me was thick, suffocating. My mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of it. The voice didn't sound human. It sounded wrong. I ran again, but this time I wasn't alone. Figures started to appear in the trees, moving just out of my sight, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They were watching me, waiting. I could feel their eyes on me as I ran, faster now. But the forest stretched out endlessly, as though it was pulling me deeper into its heart. The cold was unbearable now, my limbs shaking uncontrollably. In the distance, I thought I saw the flicker of a fire. I ran toward it, praying that it was real, that I wasn't losing my mind in the madness of the woods. The fire grew brighter, closer, and then I came to a stop. There, in the clearing, stood Mark. But it wasn't Mark. The figure looked like him, his clothes, his height, his face. But it was wrong. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his smile was too wide, too knowing. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, and the voice was chilling, not Mark's at all. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as the figure stepped closer. And then I understood. This was no ordinary wilderness. This wasn't just a place where people got lost. This was something far worse. This place, it claimed you. If it didn't want you to leave, you wouldn't. I turned and ran, but the figure's voice echoed in my head, whispering the truth I couldn't escape. "You are already lost." The next morning, the search team found no trace of me, no body, just an empty forest and the sound of the wind. But the hikers who came after me, they heard my voice. They saw my shadow between the trees. They never returned. Something dark lingers here, and it waits.